Hello, class. I just want to say hi and welcome back after the 1 week break. I hope y'all were able to catch your breath. I know it's been crazy times with the pandemic going on and everything, the cascade of consequences associated with it. And so I thought you could use a break. I know I benefited from the break too, so it wasn't just you. But I hope it gives us all a little bit of a time to catch our breath. Um, Today, we're focusing on culture and the importance of cultural adaptation of our interventions. I did post an extra credit related to culture of Native Americans, and so there's going to be a Facebook discussion. Um, about, I think it's titled Appreciation of Native American Culture. I can't remember the exact name, but I think it might be worthwhile to learn about a different culture, especially if it's a different culture from you, or at least to participate and maybe even contribute if you are Native American to the discussion that's going to be held on Facebook, I believe, on Thursday. Um, and if you don't get an opportunity to do that, I'll set up another um, extra credit opportunity that's also culture focused for you. And it'll probably consist of learning about a culture other than your own through the literature or even through web pages, but legitimate web pages, not junky web pages. Um, let's see, what else did I want to tell you about? I added some resources in the learning module for this week regarding assessment of acculturation. And I think the tools in there are largely used with Hispanic populations, which I think most of the work on acculturation has been done given um, very large populations of migrants from Spanish-speaking communities into the United States. Um, but I believe there's other tools out there. So it's just meant to give you an example of how you would assess acculturation given a variety of tools. So this week we had 3 articles. One focused on the importance of culturally adapting programs, especially when dealing with novel populations. Um, a second one focused on the cultural adaptation of a program for of a substance abuse intervention, or, well, that was a large focus of it, uh, reduction of risk behaviors, including substance use for African American girls. And the third one consisted of a weight loss program for Native Americans. And I really, really loved all your questions this week. I could tell that you really thought about the reading this week. And so I appreciate it. Your questions I tried to answer as quickly as possible. Some of your individual questions, maybe not all of them. And hopefully the lecture will cover the rest of it. Okay, so let's start off with the Castro et al. Article. And I know it's an older article. Its year is 2004, but many of the concepts and issues discussed in this article are still relevant today. And I can tell you that there are still many health interventionists who either have not learned about cultural adaptation in their own academic training, or do not feel it is necessary, or just forget about that component when trying to deliver interventions to new consumer groups, to new populations. And so in our own university, I've interacted with different faculty researchers who thought it was not necessary to adapt programs in any way for the local, largely Hispanic population here in Las Cruces and the surrounding border region. And so many of you asked, so isn't this common knowledge now? Isn't this what most people would do? And it seems obvious, But no, it's not being done. I can tell you it's in fact rare. And for many years, um, the funding agencies, federal funding agencies, and even foundations were really pushing for people to implement programs that were already proven to be effective without taking into consideration what the original group that validated that program as effective was or how it was different from many other, subpopulations or unique populations in the United States. So there's this encouragement to just be putting this cookie cutter programs like standardized, assuming that it would be effective with everyone just because they demonstrated effectiveness with one particular group. I think was incredibly naive at the time, even though it might have made sense initially, but anyone who's worked with different cultural groups knows that that's not okay to do. And some folks suggest, well, why don't we just try them out and see if they're effective? And you can invest a lot of money and resources into doing that and find out that it's not effective instead of really reviewing the program and then doing some quick qualitative and even community engagement to see if the intervention itself would even be well received by the local community, if it is meeting the local community's needs, and if it's even culturally acceptable, or it might even be offensive to the local community. So it is important to do those assessments when you're working with a unique population and trying to apply some evidence-based intervention, especially if it was validated with a group different from the one you're working with. So I engage in cancer research. And I know that there are a lot of clearinghouses or federal web pages where you can find a list of evidence-based programs. So I went into one such federal website that listed, evidence-based cancer prevention programs. And it gives you lots of information on those evidence-based interventions, or EBIs, as I will list them in the presentation. But it also gives you the history of the validation, demonstrating that was an evidence-based intervention, and what populations were used to validate the program. And what I quickly learned in my own review was that many of the interventions were largely validated with non-Hispanic white populations, with little diversity in the overall samples for these validation groups. So occasionally they might include some Hispanics. So out of 200 participants, there were 5 Hispanics, and that's not sufficient. There's not a sufficient subgroup to demonstrate the program was effective with that subgroup of 5. Okay, so that is a concern, and it's something that we should be aware of. Another common question that came out this week was, is culture theory its own theory, or can it be used in partnership with the behavior change theories? So I can tell you that culture theory is not a behavior change theory per se. It is a theory that complements behavior change theories, so that you can have an evidence-based intervention that is theory-based, right? So say someone developed an intervention that focused on the theory of planned behavior. And they tested it out with their special homogeneous non-Hispanic white population. And they found out, in fact, it was a very effective intervention in reducing, say, weight loss. Okay. So now, they want to take this program, this theory-based program, and apply it to a new population. Well, that's where culture theory comes into play, right? what are the cultural aspects of this population that might be influencing the behavior, that might be influencing, more important, a population's willingness to accept this program that does not appear to be culturally relevant to them or to their needs. Okay? And so that's really the focus of this week's lecture. Like, what cultural components can need to be addressed, right? What are unique cultural components, and how do we adapt those theory-based constructs, the way we're targeting them within these cultural subgroups? Okay. So one of the things that happens in prevention science is that now that we are understanding that we need to culturally adapt the programs, there is kind of like these competing aims. One is to keep the universal, or to develop these universal health intervention programs, right? Because human behavior is human behavior. And so attitudes might impact whether we engage with that behavior or not, but the specific attitudes might differ across different cultures, right? So how do we develop this universal intervention that is theory-based and implement it with fidelity, while at the same time trying to make sure that we are responsive to the cultural needs of the new target population, right? So we want to design a health intervention that engages the consumer group effectively and retains them in the interventions we're trying to provide. The adaptation needs to take into account many factors, right? Many of the cultural aspects that we're going to talk about in a little bit. And it cannot be this superficial adaptation, right? So many times people say, well, yes, we adapted the program. We translated it to Spanish or to Chinese or to whatever the respective language that was needed for the particular subgroup of focus, right? Or we put in role models that were from the target population, right? We put in African American role models in our educational videos. Like, that is also good, but it's still superficial. If you're not addressing the unique needs or beliefs of that population, it doesn't matter that you put a Black role model or that you translated the language to Spanish when you didn't even take into consideration many of the cultural beliefs or even the environmental barriers influencing this new target population. Okay. So the program content needs to be modified for the new population that you're going to be addressing, and also the form of delivery, so that the original form of delivery, maybe it was via computer, might all of a sudden not be appropriate for your new target population, say Native Americans living on tribal lands who really lack access to internet, right? It's like an internet-based intervention. Are you kidding me? Like, most people many people do not have access to internet or reliable access to internet. Okay. Some folks on tribal lands may lack regular access to utilities such as electricity. And so that's another factor, right? And so there's lots of issues to examine and explore when you're working with a new target population. Let's see. But at the same time, if we're taking an evidence-based intervention, right, that incorporates some therapeutic components, or that incorporates some theoretical constructs believed to be related to behavior change that are universal, right? That doesn't change just because attitudes can still impact the behavior. It doesn't matter what cultural or ethnic group or subgroup you are. That the attitudes might vary by group, and that you do need to pay attention to what the attitudes are within each group that are impacting the behavior. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. But there's this tension that they talk about when we're trying to adapt a program, making sure that we remain loyal to those original therapeutic and theory-based constructs in the intervention. And so that fidelity to the original program, right? Think of fidelity, being loyal to the therapeutic components of the original program is what they're talking about here, right? We don't want to modify a program and we end up with something that is not at all theory-based in terms of behavior change theory, right? Especially when the original was. Okay, what else did I want to tell you here? Somebody asked a question about culturally adapting a program for non-Hispanic whites when the original program was originally tailored and validated with a non-Hispanic white population. But even within this very broad category of non-Hispanic whites, we have different subcultures even within this large population, right? Because the non-Hispanic white population is not as homogeneous as we would like to think, right? It depends where you grew up and what the culture is in those specific regions that people grow up as well, right? And their national origins might also bring with it unique beliefs as well, right? So you do still have to make sure you're evaluating the new population, even if it's just the new population of the same group, of the same validation group, right? But they might still be different somehow. Okay. Let's see. Okay. So one of the things that Castro talked about was engaging the community and assisting you to adapt the program. And so they talked about using both a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And so the top-down approach means the scientists coming in with everything they've learned in terms of, say, behavior change theory or whatever their expertise is to developing this intervention, right? But then we also need that bottom-up approach and making sure we're addressing the community that is going to receive the program. So that community engagement is so important, not only in identifying the needs of the community and whether this program is meeting those needs, but also in kind of how are we going to tweak the program and what are the important norms and values and beliefs of this unique population that might impact the effectiveness of the theory-based intervention. Okay, and so when you engage the community in all aspects of the research, from the planning phases all the way to through implementation and the evaluation, interpretation of outcomes, that is referred to as community-based participatory research. Okay. And it's highly recommended. It's really promoted through many funding agencies now, including NIH, CDC. Okay. So what else did I want to tell you? So by engaging the community in the developmental process or in the adaptation process of an evidence-based program, you are increasing the chances that the target population will actually like the program, that they'll be engaged to participate in the program, and that they will be retained throughout the duration of your intervention. Okay? And that's kind of what they mean by the buy-in by the consumer group. Okay? We need that buy-in. And you better believe it, if you don't engage that community, you may not have that buy-in. even me as a Hispanic woman who is living here on the U.S.-Mexico border, I'm already a little bit different from the general population, right? I've been academically trained at high levels and have been interacting with other folks. And so I'm already a little bit different. And I still have to engage the Hispanic community when we are trying to adapt programs that will affect our border population or a specific subgroup of Hispanics, right? So I work with cancer patients. I've never had cancer. No one in my family has had cancer. So I really had to work with cancer patients, cancer survivors, to inform me about what were the needs, right? So even a subgroup within Hispanics um, have very unique beliefs and thoughts, and values change when you get cancer. Um, what's important to you. Um, so you can see how even a subgroup might be a subgroup within a cultural group might vary quite a bit, and you still have to go in and explore what is driving their behavior. Okay. Let's see. Let me see. Yeah. Okay. So we're on potential sources of mismatch. Um, so yes, some of you ask questions about sources of mismatch. So you can imagine we took a program that was originally developed with non-Hispanic white women who lived in a very well-resourced community in Seattle and who were of middle to upper socioeconomic status, meaning they probably had higher education, had completed higher education, had higher incomes, were probably all insured, right? And we had to take this program that was proven to be effective with these folks, right? In Seattle and other big cities like Washington, D.C., and Chicago, and we had to bring it here to the U.S.-Mexico border. And now, how are these two populations different? The validation group of non-Hispanic white women of middle to upper socioeconomic status from a very well medically resourced community to Hispanic women on the U.S.-Mexico border who are of middle to lower socioeconomic status. What major differences occur within these groups that might affect behavior? So in terms of SES, well, we already said, right, they vary. One is more privileged, one is less privileged. What about the cultural beliefs? Hispanic beliefs related to cancer and related behaviors versus non-Hispanic white cultural beliefs, right? They're different. What are the norms in each of those communities? What are the values? What are the other determinants of health? So I can tell you that we thought about many determinants of health impacting cancer patients here on the U.S.-Mexico border. And as much as we thought about it and worked to adapt the program that we were working on, when we actually implemented it, we learned that we missed, a few additional social determinants of health. And we had to learn to address them within our intervention. And so I'll talk about that a little bit later, I think. We got to think about past experiences. So our past experiences shape the way we think, what we believe, what we value, right? And so if we are a group, say you're working with a group that has significant historical trauma, like Native Americans or African Americans, those are things that influence the way we think and what we value and what we believe, right? Especially if they're populations that have experienced extreme discrimination. And now compare that to a validation group of non-Hispanic white people. right, who may not have experienced the same racism, discrimination, or historical trauma, right, or violations. Um, so you got to think about those, how are these two groups different? How are the two groups different, and how might they make these program that was developed with this group not so effective with this other group? Place matters, right? We know place matters. So where you live influences whether you can engage in certain behaviors, whether it be your social environment and the cultural norms about how we should behave, or what's acceptable behavior or desirable behavior, or and also the physical environment can really affect our ability to engage in certain behaviors. And so you automatically we think about food deserts, right? So some areas, you might try to promote healthy eating, but the food desert does not lend itself, right, to eating so healthy. Um, Physical activity. So if you're in a very rural area or area that's lacking parks or recreational areas or even sidewalks to walk on, or there's safety issues in the environment, is that going to affect our ability to engage in physical activity outside? Absolutely. Even if it's not related to socioeconomic status or urban risk factors, you might live in a place that is very, very cold, right? So how we implement a physical activity intervention um, somewhere where it's really cold, 75% of the year, right? It's like, so you have to be thinking about these things. Um, a few of you talked about population diversity. How do we tailor the program when the target population that we're working with is diverse in nature? And I think in those cases, the adaptation tends to try to focus on common factors across the diverse groups. But then, the greater cultural adaptation works with the larger group in the diverse population. And often that group is, many times it's non-Hispanic whites, unless you live in an area like El Paso, Texas, where it's, 81% Hispanic, then the dominant group will be Hispanic and the program would be adopted largely for Hispanics. Let's see, program delivery staff. So, I mean, we come into this across this issue with many, many programs, right? I mean, many times the delivery staff providing the intervention can be quite different from the target population. Um, and that's okay. It's not totally, how do you say, prohibitive to an effective program, but there has to be some level of cultural sensitivity, humility, competence. And so competence doesn't mean you become one with a unique group. It just means that you're aware, you're knowledgeable on some of the factors that affect them. You are working with the community. You know to work with the community to help adapt your program, right? But it is cool when you can have the program delivery staff that recruits, well, not only the delivery staff, but even the recruiting sources to be similar to the target population. So many times if we have research assistants or even the PI themselves are of the cultural group, it can bring some insights through those people to the intervention and the adaptation. Let's see.